I was very fortunate. When I was 22 years old, actually when I was 19 is when it started, to find the idea of the spiritual purpose of life. But my quest was not for a spiritual path. My quest was for exactly what we're talking about tonight, how to be happy. Because it seemed to me that everything else that people were teaching me was because it was their idea that somehow my life would be better if I got this education, if I got this job, if I got this money, if I had all these things. But they weren't answering the only question that seemed important to me, which is not what I'm going to do, but how will I feel when I'm doing that? And if what I was doing did not make me feel the way I wanted to feel, why would I do it? And it was in my mind, it was on the word happiness. It was just how to be happy. And I had this, passionate desire to understand how to be happy, which was very ironic because I was perfectly happy. I had a very nice upbringing. I'd never had any difficulties in my life at that point. But I think later I began to learn about reincarnation. And of course, every life it leaves an impression on your consciousness. And I think I had plenty of misery in the past. And I was determined not to go there again. And at the age of 19, I discovered basically the ancient teachings of India through Vivekananda, who was a great disciple of a great master, very intellectually oriented, which suited me extremely well at the time. And I studied intellectually for almost 3 years. I started reading philosophy, but then I wanted to know how to live it. So I started reading the lives of great yogis, great masters, great saints. At that time, information came through books, and there was a very good bookstore, and I would just go in. I got to the section of people, and I just started reading through it like this. I was much too scared to think of going to India to live in a cave. That was just like so far out of my comfort zone, it never crossed my mind. I was raised in a Jewish family, so it would be pretty hard for me to become a Christian missionary, which was what a lot of them were doing. Later I came to appreciate Jesus, but at that time it was not an option. And for the same reason, being a Catholic nun seemed kind of goofy to me, especially since at that time I wanted to marry and have children, just was out of the question. So I really didn't have any idea what to do. And I remember I was living in San Francisco at that time. This would have been 1968 maybe. And I was looking out at the back garden, and I actually thought I would lose my mind. By then I had already found this path intellectually, but I couldn't do anything about it. And I remember thinking I would have a nervous breakdown. And I honestly think this is past life memories. I imagine I could just see how the whole thing would play out. That one of my friends would realize that I'd lost my mental balance. They would call the medical people. The medical people would come and get me. They would take me to a medical hospital. I would be in the hospital for a long period of time. Then they would finally bring me back to my apartment so I could live on my own, and I would be standing looking out the window wondering what I was going to do with my life. And I had this very practical thought. That's going to be very expensive and take a lot of time. I think I won't do that. But that was how I felt. And right after that, or very soon after that, my friend met Swami Kriyananda, who is an American man, disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. These are names that may become meaningful to you, maybe not. Yogananda is an Indian teacher who came to the West, to America, in 1920. Kriyananda was of an age that he knew Yogananda personally. But Yogananda passed in just after I was born, so I never met him. But Kriyananda became the force for me. And I met him, and I was 22, he was 41, 43, 21 years more. And as soon as I saw him, before he even talked, he had a vibration about him. That's the only thing I can say. He emanated something I had never seen. And it was a kind of power, but not an unpleasant power, just like he was in command of his life in a way that I'd never seen. He was also very, very joyful, and he was not small. And seeing him by contrast, I realized how small I always felt. That I was just so confined by fears and worries and all these things, and he wasn't. And this was all intuition, which 45 years later has been verified by experience, but in the moment it was just recognition. But I just felt wherever he was, that's where I needed to be. It wasn't reasonable. Because he had what I wanted. And so all the years since have been my trying to get into my consciousness what he had in his already. And it is the nature of joy to want to share itself. And I was so excited about this, and always have been, that I feel like it's a fundamental part of my job, my divinely given job, so to speak, that if it's important to me, I have to share it with others. If it helped me, then I have to share it with others. And Kriyananda was starting a community, and I joined that community, and we had a retreat, and he understood my temperament. So from the very beginning, I'd get 2 molecules of information over here, and then I'd go over here and give it to someone. And I've sort of just been carrying water this whole time like that, which brings me to here. I was trying to think this afternoon. At first I thought the topic was the secret of happiness, which was a little bit heavy. I couldn't think how to reduce it to one. Fortunately, it was plural, so we have a chance. The great challenge of life is that all we ever experience is what's inside our own heads, really. I mean, that's where we really live. We've been, this little traveling group, we've been on the road for about 5 or 6 weeks now. We've been in multiple cultures and languages with different people. And at some point it always occurs to you that there is a certain similarity wherever you are. And it isn't just that people are the same in their hearts every place. It's that wherever you go, you're there. I'm always present. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and it's like, oh, there you are again. And I'm sort of surprised that she's just still there. Don't you have any hobbies? Don't you have any other place to go? Wherever I am, that defines the reality. I see everything through my own consciousness. And of course, if you have friends and you compare notes, people can be in exactly the same circumstances and have extremely different experiences. They remember different things, they have different perceptions, because we're always experiencing life through the filter of our own consciousness. And understanding how that filter is formed and how that filter influences us, obviously, is an extremely important part of figuring out how to live a happy life. Because if you don't take that filter into account, there's the other half of it, which is we think if we get the outside all perfectly organized, then we will have what we want. But if we only work on the outside without taking the inside into account, we end up also very confused. If we only take the inside into account, we can end up broke and lonely and homeless. And so it has to be a perfect blend of both of these. On the in terms of the spiritual life, the historical picture we have of the spiritual life is repudiating external life, ordinary life, so to speak, and going off to the cave, to the monastery, whatever it might be. Nowadays, because the consciousness of the whole planet is changing, there's this desire to start integrating both sides. We don't have to consciously know this. It's just happening. People are not as content with dogmatic ways of describing spirit, of sectarian ways of describing it. And we don't like to hear that we should be unhappy and deprived all the time. We want a different way of living. But that's where it gets complicated, because we observe, we experience that external circumstances affect us. We observe that we have a certain power within ourselves, but not complete to be able to transcend circumstances. So we're always having to walk this fine line. So the principles that I will share with you are not anything I made up. I think it's very important in matters of this importance that we not just sort of guess. And this is what all the ancient traditions in the world are about, is that we're not the first people to ask these questions. And especially the ancient traditions of India have a great deal to teach this. From the cosmic point of view, India has been really in a very real sense, the guru, the teacher of the whole planet. Of all the civilizations that have risen and fallen, Egypt's days of greatness, Babylonia's days of greatness, the Roman Empire, all these different things, they've all come and gone, come and gone. The only continuous culture on our planet is India. It's also, as a country, it's had its ups and downs of wealth and poverty and freedom and being influenced by invaders. But it's very interesting. The culture of India has always been exactly the same. They go back, and this is where the science of yoga comes from, where the fundamental teachings of meditation come from, where a very sophisticated understanding of the spiritual dimension of life. Not the same way that it's done in the West, where this is the principles, these are the practices, this is who God is, all these definitions. The Indian tradition has always been, it's called Sanatana Dharma, and people sometimes call it the eternal religion, but the actual definition that I like the most is simply that which is. It's a discussion of this necessity to balance what is going on that we see and experience with our senses, what is going on that we experience with our inner self. And they can go back thousands of years in the Indian culture, and they find artwork and illustrations and writings that are exactly the same, that talk about meditation, that talk about the chakras, the energy system, that talk about the all-pervading power of spirit, our essential spiritual nature, the everlasting nature of consciousness, the illusion that consciousness itself individually can be snuffed out merely because the body dies. These are all very relevant points. When I was even very young, and I was brought up in a good family, an intellectual, educated family, and the expectation was that I would become educated. The expectation was that I would train professionally. There was no prejudice, male or female, in my family, because those were the things that were available to me, and that was the method by which I would be made secure and happy. And I had this strange, especially as I got into my teenage years, I had this strange fascination with the fact that we would all die. And I wasn't afraid of death. necessarily. It didn't come to me like that. But I was very aware of the fact that everything would end at a certain point. And I was always puzzled that nobody seemed to take that into account. Nobody seemed to talk about what the fact that we would die or what would happen after we died. And again, I have to say from past lives, I had this picture in my mind of what my deathbed scene would be like, which was actually very interesting because I'd never been at a deathbed. I didn't even know anybody who had died. I mean, in the sense that I had known them when they were living. I'd known of people who had died. And I had this deathbed scene in my mind that incidentally, interestingly, has been borne out multiple times because since then, because I'm part of a very large community, and also because of my role in it, I've actually sat at the deathbed multiple times. But I remember thinking of it like this. I had confidence, basically, that I could do whatever I set my mind to do. So maybe I'd be a college professor, maybe I'd be a lawyer. I don't think I would ever have been a doctor because I'm too squeamish. I could never have done that. But maybe I'd make money in business. Perhaps I'd be a great actress. That was an option too. Theoretical. But all of them I knew would end with me on my deathbed. And I had this awareness that no matter how much I had, no matter how much people loved me, and people always liked me, so I expected to be surrounded by people who loved me, I would be alone with my consciousness. And the interesting thing was I hardly even knew that word, consciousness. But I would be alone in myself, and everything else would go away, and who I was alone in myself would be the only thing that would actually matter at that point. And I could even see the way my face would shrink and all the things that I subsequently found out were true. And I even had this picture of how people would chat around my deathbed. I've been at deathbed scenes, and you can only sustain the seriousness for a certain amount of time. And then things happen like, well, shall we go have breakfast or shall we have dinner, brought in? You're sitting around somebody who's dying. But if they're a little bit unconscious, by this time you start talking about very ordinary things. You start making macabre jokes, and it's just the way it is. I saw the whole thing. I saw it all acting out. I saw everybody getting farther and farther away, and everything I was attached to becoming less and less acceptable to me. And somehow I knew I would never disappear. It's just the context would entirely change. Now, of course, when you're young, you think it's going to be a long ways away. When you're as old as I am, you're closer to that end than you are to this end. But still, there's this idea in our minds that we're never going to have to face that. So now we have all this magnificent stuff going on where people keep dying and coming back. And they die, they freeze to death on the mountain, which is here I would think of that one. You freeze to death on the mountain, or you get hit by the car, or you have cancer, or you have the operation. But you go exactly through that scene. You just step out of it. And then all of a sudden people say, oh my gosh, it was never what I thought it was. It was never what I thought it was. I thought all these things that I accumulated were what really mattered. There's my favorite story, I think of all, Dr. George Ritchie. And he died when he was 21 of the Spanish flu at the end of World War II in a big army hospital. And he went, and he was a Southern Baptist, and he was devoted to Jesus, and so Jesus is the one who met him. He was 21 years old, and he had never been a very nice man. He'd been very selfish. He'd been very unkind to his very dear stepmother. His grandparents, his mother's parents, were resentful of the fact that their daughter had died and the father had remarried. He was very selfish. Never did anything helpful. He's standing in his death scene, and after death, Jesus has come to greet him, not an emissary, not an angel, but Jesus himself. And his whole life, 360-degree movie, he said, is playing around them. And simultaneously, everything from when he came out of the womb, to going in the army, everything. And none of it was very laudable. And he said the only thing that was on the screen that looked any good at all was that he'd been a Boy Scout and he'd gotten a lot of badges and he'd become an Eagle Scout. And so he's terribly embarrassed, and Jesus says to him, only one question, how much have you loved? And Dr. Ritchie says, I'm really young, I never had a chance, it's not really fair. Jesus is unmoved. How much have you loved? And Dr. Ritchie could see self-evidently that he hadn't loved very much. It hadn't even crossed his mind that that was what he was supposed to be doing. So he finally tries to block out a lot of the embarrassing parts and reach over here to point to where he'd become an Eagle Scout like this. And he's actually trying to keep Jesus from seeing the bad parts of his life like that. And he said, Jesus saw right through it, and the motive was transparent. Jesus knew immediately what he was trying to do. And then Dr. Ritchie says, it amused Jesus that he was trying to hide like that. He didn't judge. He didn't condemn. He was sympathetic and thought it was kind of funny that this poor guy was trying to wiggle out of it like this. And then what happened, Dr. Ritchie said, is he completely surrendered. And instead of trying to pretend to be something he wasn't, he just surrendered to what he exactly was. Partly he could do that. The reason he could do that is because he could feel how much God, through the form of Jesus, how much he was loved. And once he felt how much he was loved, he thought, what am I trying to do here? Why am I always trying to be something that I'm not, when what I am is completely acceptable to no less a judge than Jesus himself? And then he was sent back to his body. But ever thereafter, for the rest of his life, he was ready to answer that question differently. And he realized that in every situation of his life, there was only one question: how much have you loved? And understand, true love is not just a simpering kind of niceness. Because it's not merely that we love people and their delusions and their egos, and we always want to comfort you and make you feel better. What you have to love is you have to love truth itself. What is, and what truth is not somebody's dogma about truth. It's not some institution's explanation, some philosopher's idea. Truth is that which takes us closer and closer into the heart of our own nature and into the experience of what reality really is. We are a part of all that is one of the ways that Swami Kriyananda has expressed that. We are not separate. We are not separate from our brothers and sisters. We are not separate from the natural world. We are not separate from consciousness itself. So we can pass many, many lifetimes. The principle of reincarnation as it is expressed is we have all the time in the world. We have eternity. We can do our best to figure it out, how to find perfect happiness, how to conform to higher realities. If we don't make it, we get to go on and do it again. And the ancient teachings of India talk about the energy pattern within us, which is the chakra system, and how everything that we do answers certain questions in certain ways, and therefore commits us to a certain vibration of reality. There are people in the world who can see the other side, so to speak, even when sitting here. There are psychics and mediums like that, or every so often the veil just shifts and we realize what's going on here is multidimensional in ways that we didn't know before. Or we die and we get to come back and we find that out. But the entire and only purpose of our life, think of it like this, is ever expanding awareness. And awareness is a very neutral word. It's not a religious word, it's not a God word. But if you reflect on everything that you think of as progress in your own life, and you start from childhood, you know, a little child can be frightened by its own hand because its hand will come up and just shoot like this. They have no control over themselves, and there's this thing here, and it's all of a sudden very scary to them. Or we can be afraid of a crack in the sidewalk, our own shadow, going into a college classroom and not knowing anyone. But when we expand and become more capable in the world, it's always because our awareness has increased. And even within ourselves, when we confront and learn something, it's always because we become aware of some dimension of truth, of reality around us that we weren't aware of before. In other words, we don't really acquire. We merely awaken to that which is. And if you've had any really significant shifts in awareness, perhaps an understanding of oneself, you know, who I really am, what I really want, what would really bring me happiness, the question has to be asked, how much more is there for me to be aware of that I'm not yet aware of? And the ancient teachings of India say we will never stop expanding our awareness until we literally become infinite in our awareness. And that's what the sages and the masters and Jesus the Christ himself, Krishna, Buddha, myself I know, Yogananda, Swami Kriyananda, they're just greatly expanded awareness so that what was natural to them was just a much bigger view of reality. So in our little, you know, perspective on all of this, where we're always caught is between these two forces, which is we think life is designed for ease and comfort and pleasure. And even if we use the word bad, it usually means it wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, it wasn't pleasurable. And when we talk about sort of building our lives in a positive way, you know, we'll have a good job that we like, of course, and then we'll have a nice place to live, and then we'll have enough money, and then we'll have people who will take care of us, and, you know, and we'll be in the place we want. And all of it is, the more easy, the more comfortable, then the better it will be. We seldom think, I want challenge after challenge after challenge. I want to lose everything and have to rebuild again and again. You know, nobody writes that out for their life plan. But the question is, what is it that really makes us happy? Because these are the two poles. One pole is the less energy I have to put out, the more predictable, the more I can hold my security, that's good. And the other is that the more energy I can put out, the more I can expand my awareness, the more I can grow. That's what I really want. And whenever we have a choice of challenges in our life, we're always making a decision as to whether I'm going to shrink my consciousness and try to get through it, or whether I'm going to face into it and expand my consciousness and learn and grow. You know, like this. And shrinking our consciousness is like, do I drink alcohol? Do I take drugs? Do I go to sleep? Do I seek out over-sexuality? Do I eat too much ice cream? You know, just things that take the edge off of our awareness. And then just wait, we try to outlast the experience. Now, I'm by no means suggesting we go out and look for trouble. But if we have the habit in our lives of meeting challenges with increased dynamism, and see what we're talking about is the internal reality. You know, what is my internal reality? Is it fearful? Is it small? Is it trying to hide? Or is it courageous and willing and able, because I practiced when it was easier, to rise to the occasion? Now, this all leads us to, sort of the balance between these two realities, which is living in our inner world and facing into the outer world. So we have to make decisions. When I was talking about levels of consciousness, levels of reality in terms of the chakras, think about it like this. The questions that have to be answered is, the first one is, who am I at all? Am I this body? Am I this identity that's going to last as long as this body lasts? Or is there something in me that is more enduring than that? So who am I is the first question. Second question is, what is this planet that I live on? Is it merely the fixed material things, or is there some element of consciousness, and is there a conscious guiding force that I can actually feel intuitively inside of me that will guide me, that will be my companion? In other words, am I completely alone? Is it just my own ideas that are the only reality, or is there some overarching truth that I'm trying to tune into? And then the question is, what brings me not merely ease and pleasure, but what way of living actually brings me lasting happiness? And by the same token, what causes suffering? A friend of mine very much wanted to be married. And she was not attracting a partner to herself, and so she read somewhere that if you want to attract a partner, you need to be very specific about what you want. So she sat down and she wrote out actually 3 pages of conditions that she wanted. These are all the things that she wanted her husband to be. And after she had created this compelling document on the universe, she, for some reason, and I never have actually asked her why, she thought it was a good idea to show it to Swami Kriyananda, who was her teacher as well as the teacher of many of us. So she shows him this, showing how she's, really has it together now. She's going to attract the husband she wants. So he reads carefully, very attentively, he reads the 3 pages of comments that she's made. And then he says to her, very, very comfortingly, but truthfully, "My dear, you want Jesus Christ to marry you." And then he said, "And Jesus would not marry you." and then he went further to say, "And even if he did, you would not be happy with him." He said, "You need someone a little closer to your own level." So she tore up the 3 pieces of paper. She wrote, "I want a husband who loves God," because that's how she lived. "And I want him to have a good sense of humor." Yeah. And shortly after, she met the man she's been married to for 30 years. And he does love God, and he has a great sense of humor. Like that. And ironically, he was born on Christmas Day. Which was God's just little joke that he just stuck there on the side. But you see, sometimes we just make up what we think is going to make us happy, which is not based on a full understanding of who we really are. We have to increase our awareness. What would really make me happy? What am I really looking for in my life? And to be honest about that takes a long time. So then what I was saying is, every time we think or act or have a feeling about anything, we are actually affirming a whole set of beliefs about what we think is going to make us happy and what we think is going to cause suffering. I have to, be honest in myself when I can talk about all this philosophy very easily in life and death and God is in charge and things like that. Many years ago, I live in California. I live south of San Francisco, so we're sort of in the earthquake part of the world, although we have rarely had earthquakes. But in 1989, now a long time ago, was the last time we had a really big earthquake down there. And I live in a wooden building, and I was inside the building, And the earthquakes, earthquakes do not announce themselves. Just before they aren't happening, they are happening, So you're always completely taken by surprise. So I was just in my house, and all of a sudden the house just began to shake like this. Logic tells me the problem is that the house is shaking. That's just, the way your brain works. So I should get out of the house, which fortunately I was ground floor. I just ran out opened the doorway and ran out into this big green courtyard. But when I got outside, I realized now it wasn't a question of the building. The question was the earth was undulating like this. The earth is undulating. These big trees are going like this. In this community where I live, there was a swimming pool. Most of the water of the swimming pool comes up in this tsunami, and goes over the fence and falls like this. And everything in me is like, the earth doesn't do this. Just a big part of me, it doesn't do this. But the most amazing thing to me is I ran out of the building, I saw all of that, and my response was, some of my friends said later that they immediately said, oh, thank you, Divine Mother, Om Guru, like this. I said, I was just completely out of myself in every respect. I recovered, I will say, but, it didn't matter what I thought. It didn't matter how philosophical I was. In that moment, nothing was as it should have been, and I just came apart. It didn't last long, but in that moment, I was terrified, just completely terrified. That is what I believe to be true. I wasn't able, in that instant, to grab a higher perspective on it. Going down the freeway, a crazy driver, practically smashed into me once again, like this. I am the body. I have to protect the body. If the body is hurt, then I'll be hurt. Okay, that's good to know. It's good to know that that's, when it really comes to it, that's what I believe. Many other circumstances, I am impressed by the fact that I just remain perfectly calm. Like, so what? What different? A friend of mine, I think this is my all-time favorite moment. This gentleman who lived in the community that I lived in which I was the leader, and I gave all the classes and all the programs. My mouth was going all the time. This man, who was a musician and therefore always had to attend, and it wasn't you, always had to attend everything that I was doing, he sits down with me, and whatever possessed him to think this was a good thing to say, I don't know. But he said, a lot of people find you inspiring, he said, but I don't. And my first impulse was compassion. There was no part of me that wanted to defend myself. I said, I immediately, without thought, I said, oh, you poor man. It must be terrible for you. I talk all the time. So sometimes we come through. It's like there was nothing in me that needed to be inspiring. It's not, I did impose myself on a lot of people, and most of them were kinder about it than he was. But compassion was what came out of me. He's suffering, and I'm very sorry that he's suffering, and I couldn't think what to do about it right in the moment either. But every time we respond to life, we're affirming a certain reality. And that makes an impression on the energy self. The chakras are the complicated system, and if you're interested in it, you can go to my YouTube channel and type in the word chakras, because I talk about it a lot. But it's basically because we are that energy pattern. You see, that's the greatest secret of happiness, is to realize that we are not our bodies, and we are not the things that we acquire. We are not the things that we do or don't do, that we gain or lose. We are the impressions those experiences make on the energy pattern that is us. And that's why everybody filters the same experiences in a different way. Because we're holding all these, and this also, the energy pattern is formed over all these incarnations, and it is the continuing force that when the physical body dies, this is what all the death stories are, The physical body dies, the body's lying there, but that's what the dead person always realizes, that I am still there. And they're recognizably themselves, even though there's no physical object to recognize, because the vibration of that energy body is really who we are. And if you think about it, when you meet people, that's really what you're feeling, isn't it? If you have any sensitivity, you feel their vibration of consciousness. Certainly that's what I felt when Swami Kriyananda walked into the room. He had a body, he had a voice, but what I felt was that energy body, right? And that energy body determines, see, here's the other factor about it. The energy is not stationary. The energy chakra, which is what we call it, the chakra means wheel. And the collection of energy impressions in our bodies are called vrittis, and they also spin. Vritti also means whirlpool. And see, they spin, and what happens, that creates magnetism. And that magnetism either attracts or repels. So our entire destiny is that energy pattern. Our health, our good fortune, our lack of it, our opportunities. And it gradually, because it's only energy, it is always shifting. It's completely mutable. There is nothing fixed about who you think you are. Nothing fixed. It's just energy moving. And the energy that you apply, that's why Jesus asked him that question, how much have you loved? And that's why so many people who come back from the death experience realize that it wasn't the big things in their life that determined them. It was the everyday response to everything that happened, with courage, with fear, with freedom, with attachment, with joyous courage, or with contractive wishing to dull myself down and hide. And as you develop that energy pattern, that's how your life unfolds. And that's how your lifetimes ever after unfold. So what affects those energy patterns? Who am I? What do I think is real? Where does lasting happiness come from? And what causes real suffering? And this is where all the wisdom of the ancients comes from, is the direct experience of those realities. Okay? So I said questions, protests. I think
feels so
yeah.
impossible.
I think sometimes they don't know what they're talking about. I don't like absolutes in the face of real misery. I don't like platitudes when I'm underwater. It doesn't help me very much. So, and also I don't like to feel that I'm at war with myself. I don't feel I don't like to think like I'm failing. Like if you really were a spiritual person, you wouldn't be unhappy. Well, I am a spiritual person, I am unhappy, so what are we going to do about it? I think it's always extremely important to be completely authentic, that you cannot build anything except on truth. So if your actual truth is tension and fear and anxiety, we have to start with what is. That's what reality is at this moment. This is how I feel. At this moment, this is what's real to me. My most practical and helpful thing that, at least that I practice, that I find is useful, is I try to be 1 inch better than I am. Not a whole mind shift better than I am, but just 1 inch better than I am. And I also try to practice that all the time. See, it's whatever big issue one has, it's almost always also present in a small form. So if there's an inclination toward tension, if there's an inclination toward fear, if there's an inclination toward laziness or anger, or despair, whatever it might be, the mountain of it is not the time to begin to think how to work with it. You have to As Swami Kriyananda put it to me, you have to practice when it's easier, because in a moment of crisis you'll go true to form. True to form. So that means every time you get a little tense, instead of thinking, oh, it doesn't matter, that's the time to use the small techniques that you know to shift the energy. I always say to people, if you can't do any, let me say this more properly. If you can't do your best, try to do a little better than your worst. And oddly enough, if you can always do a little better than your worst, you'll find that your worst gets lighter and lighter, because it will be the habit of responding to challenge by putting out a positive response, even if it's only just a little tiny one. So if you practice that all the time when you're feeling in great despair, a piece of you will still remember. And you'll still remember that I could move this energy a little bit. And the most important thing is to realize that even to climb up a mountain, you rarely go just like that. You go like this, and then you go like that. And then you go up again, and then you go down again. And then you get to here, and you realize it's much higher than you thought it was. So you get really discouraged, and you just sit down for a while and just wait. All of that is perfectly natural. You know, many years ago, Swamiji was passing out compliments, which is not something he did he was very supportive, but he never flattered us. But there were a few people in the room, and he was saying complimentary things to them. And he wasn't noticing me, apparently, so I made myself bigger so that he would see me, so that he would say something nice to me, too. And so he looked at me and he said, "You're very sincere, Asha. Asha, you're very sincere." I thought he had nothing really good to say to me, and so he just sort of went to the bottom of the bag and just pulled out something that wasn't terrible. And it made me extremely depressed. And I was really depressed for about 2 weeks. And finally he said to me, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Well, you told this one that he was doing really well, and that one that he, was making a good contribution. Me, you said I was just sincere." And he was startled. And he said to me, "Asha, sincerity is everything." Just like that. It's everything. Which means I'm not pretending. See, that's what it actually is. The mere fact that you can still be tense and upset does not mean that you aren't a deeply sincere person working very hard on yourself. And so the second half that I developed out of that was, I am very sincere in my aspirations, and this must be what happens to sincere people. Meaning, there's nothing at all wrong with me. This is just my route up the mountain, which is I have a karmic tendency and an energy in my chakras that causes me to react in this way. So I can't stop the momentum of what I've been doing all this time, but I can do my best to be calm about it and to do what little thing I can do, not some big platitude about it, but just what little thing I can do, because that will eventually turn the tide. And all of us have these very, very deep habits. And we just have to have part of the courage of finding happiness is to recognize that it's okay. We can just do this a step at a time. It's going to be all right. Because half of what happens is what happens, and the other half is being upset because of what happened. And if you can take away, I'm not upset, this is how I think of it also. Eventually I'm going to get this right, and that means that perfection is infinite, literally. Imperfection is finite. So that means there's an end to it. So even if I have to do it 9,767 more times, it just happened once, so now it's only 66. and I just always keep this optimistic attitude that this is going to end because I'm sincere. because I'm not committed to this. One last thought. There are those actions to which you are committed, and then there are those things which you commit. And what you commit is, relatively speaking, less important than what you're committed to, because that's your future. Fair enough? And in between, we suffer. And you just have to have the courage to suffer. Anything else? Any other thoughts? Right. Right, I do understand the point. I mean, people often say, if you concentrate on negative things, you create energy for them. It's not quite as simple as that. Okay. Let me just first of all, the biggest difficulty with external events is that they're cosmic forces that are moving these. They're karmic waves that have been set in motion, and one person's reading about it and being nervous about it is not sufficient to change the destiny of the planet. So there's a piece of it where you have to be realistic. But the other part is, this is where the inner and the outer consciousness have to come together. We cannot take responsibility for everything, right? And part of one of our inner filters is very confusing for us, is the belief that we have to take responsibility for everything, which is an exaggerated or an unfocused understanding of the purpose of my own life. And we also have to appreciate that it's the vibrations of our own thoughts that we have to learn to manage. And we also have to be realistic about who I am and what I can manage. So therefore, if, for example, concentrating too much on these external events which feel really outside of our control cause an increasing agitated vibration in us, that's not the proper line for us to follow. However, if we want to contribute to the positive reality of this planet, we need to find a way that we can do something that creates positive vibrations in this world. So, for example, I am not at all political in the normal sense of the word. For many years in my life in the USA, I didn't even vote because I just wasn't involved in that world sufficiently. The first time I went to India, which was 40-some years ago, when India was even more undeveloped than it is now, I saw people sleeping on the streets, I saw beggars, I saw things I'd never seen before. And I immediately realized that as a planet, we had all the resources, all the technology, we could take care of everyone. There was no reason for this to exist. The reason it existed is because people didn't want to fix it. And the issue was not resources, the issue was the human heart. The human heart was too self-concerned, was just simply too selfish. If I give away too much of what I have, I'll have less. It was just all about the human heart. And I realized that what I've really been doing with my life, which is teaching people to meditate, to understand their interconnectedness with the planet, with other people, with the natural forces, is going to change the human heart. And when the human heart is changed, then these problems will be solved. And so I've turned my back on an enormous number of things that I could have given my life to, because this piece of it is where it's really going to work for me. And Swami Kriyananda said, one should devote oneself in a selfless way to whatever parts of creation resonate with you, because we all have different karmas to fulfill. Some people are deeply devoted to the care of animals. Others raise their own children. Some people grow flowers. Some people teach people to meditate. You do whatever piece of it resonates with why you feel you're here and gives you the capacity to contribute positively to the planet. And then you're doing your part. And once you really start doing your part, you don't feel like you have to carry the weight of all of it. And even to just live a very humble life with no particular, even if you wish to live just a humble life with no particular causes, but every encounter, you're going to be able to say to Jesus, whoever greets you, how much did I love? As much as I could. As much as I was capable of doing, as much as would be accepted. How much did you love? This is what the death and return people come back and tell us every time, that much more than we realize. The real important encounters were all the little ones where we had the opportunity to give love, to give compassion, to give support, and we either did or we didn't, because that is the energy pattern of who we actually are. And much more than people know. Even climate change itself, Yogananda said, is because of all the dissonant human vibrations. All the selfishness, all the greed, all the anger. So each one of us, by becoming a better version of ourselves, it much more than people realize are actually shifting all of those qualities. Not enough to really stop it, because there's too much other karma, but sufficient to change our karma in the situation and change the karma of the people around us. It was interesting, a woman friend of mine, her daughter is a very, very successful businesswoman. She's been very active in politics, and she uses her wealth and her position. She's taken up some global causes, and she's taken up causes like sex trafficking and child slavery and things like that. And God bless her for doing it. But when my friend told me, because I know the daughter, I said, oh, so she gets to be angry all the time. And the mother said, yeah, that's exactly right. It's like she wants to be angry, so she's picked up causes where she can always be angry. I appreciate that she's trying, but as Swamiji put it, if you're going to work for peace, you have to work peacefully. If you try to work for a good cause with dissonant energy, it's certainly not as good. Let's just put it that way. At least you're using your anger for something more righteous. It's who we are inside that actually affects the world. And so you have to, this is where it's a whole program. You have to become knowledgeable about yourself. You have to learn how to put out dynamic energy. And you have to introspect. Who am I really? And then you have to have the humility to say, this is who I am. This is all I can do. But I will do what I can do with the very best energy I can give it. Does that make sense? Yeah, very good question.